A black businessman in a sharp suit steps off his private jet, ready to board his own airline like he's done 100 times before. But within moments, everything flips. A flight attendant with a chip on her shoulder stops him cold, tears up his first-class pass, and accuses him of faking it all because she can't imagine a black man owning the airline. 7 minutes later, security drags him out like a criminal. What happens next? It doesn't just shock the passengers, it ignites a firestorm across the nation. You're not going to believe how this ends. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. But before we dive in, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from, and if this story moves you, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more true stories that challenge what we think we know. Lightning tore the sky open like an old wound as Marcus Reynolds stepped out of his private jet into the rain-drenched night in Houston. His polished shoes met the rubber of the jet bridge with quiet authority, and for a moment, he carried the air of a man who knew exactly where he belonged. He held a tablet in one hand, its screen glowing with his first-class confirmation, his name in bold, his posture dignified. To any onlooker, he was just another successful businessman, refined, composed, black. But to Karen Holt, the flight attendant with a smile sharp as a razor and eyes that judged before facts were seen, he was something else. She stood in his path, arms crossed, her Apex Airlines badge catching the light like it meant something more than plastic. "Economy's that way," she said, with the flippant tone of someone who'd made up their mind long ago. Then, without a flicker of hesitation, she reached out and ripped the boarding pass from his fingers. Now, imagine this moment not as some isolated misunderstanding, but as the first domino in a long line of judgment, of assumptions layered over time like old wallpaper, one you've seen too many times in your life. You've been there, haven't you? Misjudged, overlooked, dismissed, not because of what you said or did, but because of how you looked or who they thought you were. You may be 65, 75, 85, but you remember that feeling. It stays in the blood like a silent song. As the thunder cracked again, Marcus tried to respond with grace. He adjusted his tie, steadied his breath, said nothing. His silence wasn't weakness, it was calculation. Because when someone tries to reduce you, especially in front of others, reacting too fast hands them the story they already wrote about you. That's what this was. Karen had a script, and she was determined to play her part, regardless of the truth. She shoved him toward the terminal, her authority puffed up like a balloon, oblivious to the fact that Marcus didn't just fly Apex Airlines, he owned it. That's right. He was the majority shareholder, the man behind the curtain, the one whose name appeared on contracts and whose vision lifted the brand from nothing to power. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All she saw was someone who, in her world, didn't fit in seat 1A. Now, why does this matter to you? Because injustice doesn't knock, kicks the door open. And even when you think your fight is over, when you've built, earned, succeeded, it will test you again, and again, and again. The storm outside mirrored the one inside Marcus as he stood there, not as a CEO, not as a man of means, but as someone once again reminded that no matter how far you've come, someone might still try to drag you back. But here's the truth, plain and simple. When you know your worth, they can tear up your ticket, but they can't cancel your seat. So if you're reading this or listening, remember this: your dignity is not up for debate. No one gets to decide your place but you. Stand tall, speak when needed, and when you must be silent, let it be the kind of silence that shakes the room. You've made it through 1,000 storms. And if Marcus could be shoved aside on his own airline and still find the strength to breathe, to stand, to think, then so can you. Let this be your reminder. Age does not mean quiet. Wisdom is meant to roar. Rain beat against the terminal windows like an old blues rhythm, steady and unforgiving. As Marcus Reynolds walked behind Karen Holt through the narrow jet bridge, every step echoing the insult he'd just received. His face wore the same calm so many of us have learned to master, not because we weren't angry, but because we knew how dangerous it was to show it. She strutted ahead, her blonde ponytail bobbing like a metronome, every movement screaming authority she believed was hers by birthright. Her voice rang out as she reached the gate desk. "This guy thinks he's slick with a fake first-class pass. I'm not letting him back on until we sort this out." And just like that, she didn't just question his boarding pass, she questioned him. His right to be there. His right to belong. You've been there, haven't you? Not necessarily at an airport. Maybe it was a grocery store, a bank, a restaurant where the server looked past you like you were invisible, or worse, looked right at you and saw something less. It wasn't what they said. It was how they said it. That tone. That tilt of the chin. That assumption. That's the thing about injustice, it wears ordinary clothes. It walks with polite smiles and polished badges. And it speaks with the confidence of someone who's never had to question their place. As the crowd stirred, murmurs spreading like heat through a summer church, Marcus reached into his jacket with slow precision, pulled out his tablet, and tapped the screen. There it was, Apex Airlines. Seat 1A. His name clear and bright. He held it up, steady as stone, and said, "Check it. I belong there." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a shout. It was a man offering truth in the face of presumption. But Karen, too certain to be curious, snatched the tablet with a sneer and spit the words so many of us have heard before. "This doesn't mean anything. Anyone can fake a screenshot. I'm calling security. Now stop and think for a moment. How many times has the truth been in your hands on paper, in records, on your tongue, and still they didn't believe you?" That's the real weight of prejudice. It doesn't care what you've done. It only cares what it thinks you are. But here's the lesson buried in this moment. Do not let their disbelief define you. You've got decades behind you. You've raised families, served your country, paid your dues. So when someone tries to drag your name through the mud, let your dignity be louder than their doubt. Stand where you are. Say what you know. And remember, just because they don't see your worth doesn't mean it isn't there. Marcus knew it too. As security was summoned and the tension thickened like molasses, he didn't raise his voice or flinch. He made a quiet call and said, "They've started it. Move forward." That's how strength speaks, measured, steady, and sure. So the next time someone questions your truth, don't yell. Don't fold. Do what Marcus did. Breathe. And move forward. Because even in the face of humiliation, dignity is a weapon they can't take unless you hand it to them. And you, my friend, have held on far too long to ever let go now. The hum of the engines vibrated through the thin walls of the crew closet like the low moan of a train on broken tracks. And Marcus Reynolds stood in the cramped steel coffin with a mop handle digging into his back and the scent of bleach stinging his throat. They'd locked him in, literally zip-tied his dignity behind a door meant for cleaning supplies. A man who owned the very airline now hidden away like a problem too inconvenient to face. It wasn't just humiliating. It was the kind of thing you don't forget. Like the time you walked into a bank and they asked if you knew what a credit check was. Like when you went to a job interview in '68 and they glanced at your name before even looking at your resume. It sticks with you, not just the insult, but the silence that follows. Because it always comes with a quiet question. How much more are you supposed to take? Outside the closet door, Karen Holt's voice pierced the metal like a knife. She was spinning her story now, twisting facts into fear. "He's unstable," she told the captain. "Said he'd make me regret it." It was a lie, clean and cold, but believable enough for those who already wanted it to be true. You know how that works. They don't need proof, they just need a little permission. And Karen spoke with the confidence of someone who'd never had to prove a thing. And that's the danger. When people with power lie, and others listen, it doesn't just distort the moment, it rewrites the entire truth. And if we don't challenge it, that lie becomes the only version that survives. Marcus didn't panic. He didn't shout. He did what survivors do. He thought. He planned. He acted. That's what decades of weathering storms had taught him. That there's always a way through, even when the door's locked and the world thinks you're beaten. He pulled out his phone, the signal weak, but just enough to text 2 words. Phase 2. It wasn't desperation. It was strategy. And if you're listening right now, let that be a lesson burned into your bones. Don't let temporary confinement fool you into believing you're powerless. You might be backed into a corner, but a corner is where many great people have planned their comeback. Now here's something practical. The next time life boxes you in, maybe it's a diagnosis, a dismissal, a door slammed in your face, don't waste your breath begging. Use your breath to breathe, regroup, reconnect, reach out to the ones who believe in you. That's what Marcus did. while Karen whispered poison through the intercom. While the guard outside pounded the door with hate wrapped in a uniform, Marcus stood still, not as a prisoner, but as a storm in stillness. He didn't let the insults settle in his soul. He let them fuel him. So if you're 65 or 85 and think the world has forgotten you, remember this. They locked Marcus in a closet thinking they'd ended the story. But all they did was close the door on a man already 3 steps ahead. And that's what you carry too: the wisdom of time, the patience of pain, the power of planning. Your age isn't a weakness. It's your sword. So sharpen it. Stand ready. And when they think you're quiet, be the voice that redefines the room. The plane shook as it sliced through thunderclouds, a metal bird bucking against the sky, and inside that trembling beast, Marcus Reynolds stood still, bound, bruised, boxed in a closet, but his mind was already miles ahead, moving like water under ice. He had seen this kind of play before, back when he was the youngest at the boardroom table, and every move he made was questioned like he hadn't built the table himself. They underestimated him then, too, and here it was again. Karen thought the closet was a coffin. What she didn't know was that she'd just built him a war room. While she strutted down the aisle basking in false victory, Marcus tapped the screen of his tablet covertly, precisely hacking into the very intercom system that had once shut him out. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same system used to silence him would now carry his truth to every ear on board. And isn't that the truth of our lives? Sometimes the very thing built to keep you quiet becomes the platform where your voice is finally heard. You've lived through decades of change, civil rights marches, protests, the slow bend of justice, and you know this. When the time is right, silence must give way to sound. Marcus made that choice. A few taps, and suddenly the overhead speakers crackled with Karen's own voice, the venom she thought no one would hear, spilling out like oil across the air. He's trouble. Should have tossed him off in Houston. And then Greg's slurs, ugly, unmistakable, echoed through first class and economy alike. Passengers turned, gasped. Phones went up like candles in a vigil, recording, remembering. Marcus didn't yell. He didn't kick down the door. He simply let the truth speak louder than lies. You see, at our age, we understand something the younger generations are still learning. Not every fight requires a fist. Sometimes, the sharpest weapon is the one you wield with quiet clarity and relentless truth. That's what Marcus did. And that's what you can do too. When you're cornered, don't rush to explode. Pause. Look for your leverage. Find your platform. In this digital age, your voice can travel farther than your feet ever could. One video, one message, one witness, it's all it takes to shift a narrative. And Marcus? He lit a match in that closet and watched the fire catch on every screen across the country. So the next time life tries to shut the door on you, remember this. You've got wisdom in your hands, memory in your bones, and a truth that deserves a stage. Speak up. Leak what they tried to hide. The world may doubt you, but if you stay ready, stay sharp, and stay honest, they will hear you. Just like they heard Marcus through wires, through steel, through silence. Let that be your reminder. The system might underestimate you, but never underestimate yourself. The rumble from the back of the plane began like a low growl, barely a murmur. Easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, but Marcus Reynolds felt it before it reached him. That old, familiar shift in the air when injustice decides it isn't done with you yet. The curtain separating first class from economy fluttered, and what stepped through wasn't just a group of angry passengers, it was a mob, stitched together by whispers, fueled by fear, and led by a woman with something to prove. Karen Holt had lost the battle of the intercom, but now she'd weaponized something older, something deeper. The need of certain people to feel superior no matter the cost. And like we've seen before during marches where police dogs bared their teeth, or courtrooms where verdicts never felt fair, when pride and prejudice dance together, they move fast and they move mean. The first voice came from a man in a cowboy hat, reeking of whiskey and entitlement, shouting, "Let's get that bastard out of here." And just like that, 5 more followed. A trucker with fists like bricks, a woman gripping her cross like it was a sword, a frat kid filming for sport, an executive with a comb-over who'd never lifted a hand in his life but was ready to condemn someone who didn't look like him. And behind them all, Karen, smiling like a pyromaniac watching her match catch flame. This wasn't about safety. It wasn't about class. It was about control, and Marcus knew it. He'd seen that look before, back in Atlanta, when he was 16 and stopped by police for walking too tall. He'd seen it in college, when professors called him well-spoken like it was a surprise. And here it was again at 30,000 feet, in a first-class seat he'd earned, bought, and owned. And here's the truth for you, my friend. The battle doesn't end when you get the title. Not when the world's been taught to believe your skin disqualifies you. Not when pride feels threatened by your presence. But there's power in being prepared. Marcus didn't cower. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't meet hate with chaos. He let it come. And when it did, when the fists flew, when he was shoved, choked, pinned, he didn't break. He moved with purpose, precision, clarity. Judo moves from his youth kicked in, but so did his years of learning when not to swing. Because sometimes the real fight isn't about knocking someone down, it's about standing up and refusing to disappear. That's a lesson worth holding close. When the mob comes, whatever form it takes in your life, you don't have to meet fire with fire. You meet it with strategy, with presence, with patience backed by purpose. Whether it's being silenced in a doctor's office, passed over at the ballot box, or looked through at a restaurant, you know when injustice rears its head. So stand your ground. Be still and unmovable. Let them come. Let them show themselves. And let the truth shine brighter than their rage. That's what Marcus did. And with every camera rolling, every eye watching, he turned their hate into history. So the next time the world tries to mob you into silence, remember this. You've outlived storms louder than their noise. Hold your ground. The world is watching, and justice favors those who endure. The cabin had gone quiet, but it wasn't peace, it was that kind of stillness before a storm turns back on itself. Before the dust settles and reveals who's still standing. Marcus Reynolds sat in his rightful seat. 1A suit torn at the shoulder, ribs aching beneath the fabric, a thin trickle of blood drying along his lip. Yet there he was, upright, composed, and burning with something far stronger than pride, purpose. Karen Holt had failed to keep him locked away, her lies unraveling in the light of truth. And Greg, her chosen hammer, had lost his grip on fear. The mob had scattered. The passengers who once watched in silence were now witnesses. Phones raised not in curiosity but in outrage. And the tide had turned. But just when it looked like it was over, Karen returned. Not humbled but hardened. Her smile cracked but still clinging to the illusion of control. She approached with a tray of coffee, a sweetness in her voice as fake as plastic flowers. "Coffee, sir?" she asked, and every word carried the venom of someone who couldn't stand to lose. Now here's where the real test begins, not in the brawl but in the aftermath. You've seen this before, haven't you? You survive the blow, stand your ground, speak your truth, and yet still, they come back for one last jab. Maybe it was an employer who fired you without cause, then smiled in your face. Maybe it was a neighbor who called the cops on your grandson, then baked cookies to pretend it never happened. The message is the same. I'm not done with you yet. And that's what Karen was saying with that coffee. The splash that hit Marcus's lap wasn't an accident. Nor were the shards of glass tucked beneath the blanket small, sharp, and planted with intent. His gasp was soft, but the pain was real, blood rising in thin lines along his fingers as he pulled back. But here's the thing about resilience. When it's deep-rooted, it doesn't just survive attacks, it uses them. Marcus looked her dead in the eyes, pain dancing behind his stare, and smiled. Not wide, just enough. "You're done," he said. And it wasn't a threat, it was a prophecy. And that, dear listener, is a reminder you must carry with you. When they try one more time to break you, don't flinch, don't rage, respond. With truth, with strength, with quiet certainty that justice doesn't always shout, it shows up. It builds, and when the time is right, it strikes. Across the aisle, a woman in 2C had seen everything. Claire Henshaw, a civil rights attorney with eyes like courtroom cross-examinations, leaned forward. "That was assault," she said plainly, her phone already recording, already live. And just like that, Marcus was no longer alone. He never really had been. Claire's live stream picked up speed like a freight train. Viewers poured in. Comments surged. And the truth, the full truth, was no longer confined to a cabin. It was in the air now, loud and clear. Let this be a truth you write on your heart. When your dignity is attacked, when your victory is challenged by one final act of spite, don't retreat. Stay seated, stay solid, and let the world see the lie unravel. Because when you carry truth in your bones, they can spill the coffee, they can draw the blood, but they can't touch your crown. Not now, not ever. The boardroom lights glared like interrogation lamps as Lena Carter stood tall in the heart of chaos, flanked by Apex's crumbling executives and a flood of media pressure outside. Her voice was steady, clipped with precision, but her eyes burned with purpose. Just hours earlier, she'd been side by side with Marcus on that flight. The storm above their heads, nothing compared to the one rising inside the cabin. She'd watched him get humiliated, dragged, locked up, and attacked. She'd streamed the truth. She'd exposed the rot. But now, just as victory seemed within reach, the gunshot rang out, a sharp crack that cut through the silence like a scream in a sanctuary, and her body jolted, her blazer blooming red. And Marcus, battered and bruised, caught her as she fell. "You're CEO now," she whispered, her breath like fog against his cheek. Then she went still, and the room was never the same again. You never forget moments like that. If you've lived long enough, and I know many of you listening have, you felt the weight of loss hit without warning. A phone call in the night, a friend who never made it home, a goodbye you never got to say. That kind of grief doesn't scream, it settles into your bones. A heavy silence you carry quietly. Marcus didn't collapse. He didn't cry out. He just held her, blood on his hands, her final words echoing not as a request, but as a mantle laid upon his shoulders. She wasn't just passing power, she was passing purpose. And that, dear listener, is the kind of inheritance the world cannot steal. But even in death, Lena's fire lived on. The USB drive clutched in Vickers' hand lit the final match, years of Apex corruption. Recordings of bribes, of abuse, of lies wrapped in polished press releases and hollow apologies. It spilled into the news cycles, took over headlines, and turned public opinion into a tidal wave. Claire's live stream hit 12 million. The teenage girl's video surged past 10. Protesters surged the courthouse steps, demanding truth, demanding change, chanting Marcus's name like a hymn. And yet Marcus' broken ribs, bloodied lips, torn suit didn't rise like a man crowned. He rose like a man rebuilt, not out of glory, out of loss. And this is what I need you to understand. Leadership doesn't always come wrapped in applause. Sometimes it comes soaked in sacrifice. You may not be running a company, but maybe you're leading your family through grief. Maybe you're holding a neighbor's hand through cancer. Maybe you're speaking truth to a doctor who won't listen. That's leadership too. That's courage. And Lena's final breath was a reminder that legacy isn't about title, it's about impact. So when the weight feels too heavy, remember Marcus. Remember how he didn't ask to lead, he was chosen by the fire. And he stepped into it not because he was ready, but because it was necessary. And maybe that's where you are now. Tired, wounded, but still standing. So if you carry someone's name in your heart, if you've buried love and walked forward anyway, if you've picked up the pieces others left behind, then hear this: you are stronger than they know. And the world is still waiting for what only you can give. Don't sit back. Don't stay quiet. You've come too far for that. The baton has been passed through blood, through fire, through the voice of a woman who believed. And now it's yours to carry. So carry it, and carry it well. The hospital room was quiet, too quiet, the kind of stillness that comes after the storm but before the reckoning. Morning light crept through the blinds like an old friend checking in, soft and honest, casting golden lines across Marcus Reynolds' bandaged frame. His ribs were wrapped tight, his arm hung in a sling, and his face, bruised and cracked, held that same unwavering fire that carried him through closets, mobs, boardrooms, and bullets. He didn't look like a CEO, he looked like a man who'd survived a war no one planned for. And yet, here he was, alive, awake, unbroken. The USB drive, Vickers' final gift, rested on the table beside him like a loaded truth waiting to detonate. And the monitors above his head beeped in rhythm with a legacy being reborn. Out there, Beyond the glass, the world was on fire, protesters flooding the streets, networks looping the footage of Karen's arrest, Hank's downfall, Judge Tate's disgrace, and inside this room, in that battered body, sat the future of Apex Airlines and something even greater. The proof that justice, though slow, could still walk in wearing the shoes of a man who refused to sit down. But the fight wasn't over, and Marcus knew it. The system doesn't yield all at once. Claws back. And sure enough, the door burst open like a bad memory. Karen Holt, eyes wild, hair tangled, a kitchen knife flashing in her trembling hand, out on bail through some clerical loophole, driven not by reason but by the raw desperation of someone who couldn't accept defeat. She lunged, screaming about what he took from her, blaming him for everything she did to herself. And in that split second, Marcus rolled not with the strength of a young man, but with the instincts of someone who'd been knocked down enough times to know exactly how to rise. He caught her wrist, twisted it with his good hand, the knife clattering to the tile. She screamed, she clawed, and still he didn't break. Security burst in, cuffs snapped tight, and as they dragged her away, all that poison and pride and privilege spilled onto the floor, exposed for the world to see. Marcus, chest heaving, blood trickling anew, looked out the window again. The sky over Austin glowed a soft blue, quiet now, but not forgotten. And this is where I speak to you because I know you understand what this kind of ending means. You, who have weathered the decades, marched when it was dangerous, prayed when hope felt thin, and spoke truth when your voice shook. You know what it costs to survive. But now it's about more than survival. It's about building something from the ashes. So here's what I offer you, plain and true. Keep going. Let your age be your armor, not your excuse. Speak louder.
Walk taller.
Mentor someone. Tell your story. Because Marcus didn't just win a fight, he lit a fire. He turned coffee burns into court cases, fists into footage, glass cuts into global outrage. He used every scar as evidence. And you can too. Whatever you've lived through, whatever hurt you carry, make it count. Don't shrink from the next battle. You are not too old to fight. You are not too tired to matter. The world is watching, and the world needs your voice. As Marcus leaned back, the nurse whispered, "They're calling you a legend." And he smiled, not the smile of victory, but the smile of a man who knows the work is just beginning. "Legends bleed too," he said. "Tell him I'm just getting started. And maybe, just maybe, so are you."